On a stretch of North African coastline, where the Mediterranean turns a deep and merciless blue, there is a hill that overlooks the water like a throne with no one left to sit on it. Walk that hill today, and you will find broken columns half swallowed by grass, the outline of harbors long since silted over, and tourists snapping photos of ruins they cannot quite name. Almost none of them know what once stood here. Almost none of them know that for nearly 700 years, this quiet hillside was the beating heart of the most feared trading empire the ancient world had ever seen. A city so wealthy that its coins have been found as far away as Britain. A navy so dominant that Rome, in its earliest days, did not dare challenge it at sea. A civilization so despised by its greatest rival that, when that rival finally won, they did not just conquer this city. According to ancient sources, they salted its earth, tore down its walls stone by stone, and tried to erase it from memory entirely. They almost succeeded. This is the story of Carthage, not the footnote Rome wanted you to remember, not the villain of someone else's epic. The real Carthage, the merchants, the sailors, the generals, and the gods they prayed to in the dark. And by the end of this story, you may find yourself asking an uncomfortable question. How much of what we think we know about the losers of history was ever actually true? To understand how Carthage rose, you first have to understand a much older civilization, the Phoenicians. Long before Rome was anything more than a scattering of huts on 7 hills, the Phoenicians were already the master sailors of the ancient Mediterranean. They came from a narrow strip of coastline in what is now Lebanon, cities like Tyre and Sidon, places hemmed in by mountains on one side and endless sea on the other. With little farmland to feed themselves, the Phoenicians did something remarkably practical. They turned outward. They built ships, and they built an empire not of legions but of trade routes. According to ancient tradition, sometime around the 9th century BCE, a group of Phoenician settlers from Tyre crossed the Mediterranean and founded a new colony on the coast of North Africa. The most famous account of this founding comes to us wrapped in legend. The story goes that a Tyrian princess named Elissa, later known to history as Dido, fled her homeland after her brother, the king, murdered her husband to seize his wealth. Dido escaped with a group of loyal followers and sailed west, eventually landing on the coast of what is now Tunisia. Here, the legend takes an almost fairy tale turn. Dido is said to have approached the local Berber ruler and asked for only as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. He agreed, likely assuming she meant a modest patch of ground. Dido then had the hide cut into impossibly thin strips and used them to encircle an entire hill. It was a masterstroke of cunning, the kind of story a trading people would love to tell about their own origins. Whether this event happened exactly as described, historians remain doubtful. What most researchers agree on is that the tale reflects something true about Carthaginian identity itself, a people who built power not through brute conquest, but through negotiation, shrewdness, and control of resources others didn't think to claim. The city they founded was called Carthage, meaning new city, which the Romans would later Latinize into the name we know today, Carthago, Carthage. At first, Carthage was simply one Phoenician colony among many, a satellite of the great mother city of Tyre. But geography had handed Carthage an extraordinary gift. Its location sat almost exactly at the narrowest crossing point of the central Mediterranean, close to Sicily, close to the vital sea lanes linking the eastern Mediterranean to the emerging markets of Spain and the Atlantic coast. Whoever controlled this narrow channel of water could tax, influence, or strangle the trade of an entire sea. For a while, Carthage grew quietly in Tyre's shadow. Then, in the 6th century BCE, everything changed. The Phoenician homeland came under increasing pressure from the great empires of Mesopotamia, and eventually Tyre itself fell under foreign domination. With its mother city weakened, Carthage stopped looking east for guidance and started building something of its own. What Carthage built was not, at least at first, a traditional empire of legions marching over conquered land. It was something more unusual for its time, a maritime commercial network held together by ships, treaties, and gold. Carthaginian merchants sailed to Spain for silver. They sailed to West Africa, according to some ancient accounts, trading through a mysterious system where goods were left on a beach and local traders would leave payment in return, neither side ever directly meeting face to face. They controlled the tin routes that fed the entire ancient world's supply of bronze. Some ancient sources even claim Carthaginian explorers sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, venturing into the open Atlantic long before anyone in Rome had dared to imagine what lay beyond the known sea. One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for Carthaginian ambition is a document known as the Periplus of Hanno, an account, translated from an original Punic inscription, describing a Carthaginian admiral named Hanno the Navigator leading a fleet of colonists down the West African coast. The text describes strange sights, burning mountains, later interpreted by some scholars as volcanic activity, and creatures the crew called gorillas, possibly early encounters with either great apes or local peoples, a detail still debated among historians today. Whatever the precise truth behind these accounts, they reveal a civilization confident enough and skilled enough to push the boundaries of the known world. By the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Carthage was no longer a colony. It was an empire in its own right, controlling territories across the coast of North Africa, much of southern Spain, western Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Its capital swelled into one of the largest cities on Earth, with some estimates suggesting a population exceeding 200,000 people at its height, though exact figures remain a subject of scholarly debate. At the center of this empire were two artificial harbors, engineering marvels that still capture the imagination of archaeologists today. One harbor was rectangular, built for commercial shipping. The other was circular, hidden from outside view, reserved entirely for the navy. According to ancient descriptions, this military harbor could house more than 200 warships, docked in covered slips arranged around a central island, with a command tower rising above them so that Carthaginian admirals could observe the entire fleet at a glance. It was, in essence, a secret naval base disguised within a bustling port city, a design so effective that when Roman forces finally captured Carthage, they were reportedly astonished by what they found. Carthaginian society itself was structured in ways historians still work to fully reconstruct, since so much of what we know comes filtered through the writings of their enemies. What survives suggests a sophisticated republic, governed not by a single king, but by elected magistrates known as suffetes, along with a powerful senate composed of the city's wealthiest merchant families. Some scholars have drawn comparisons between Carthage's political system and the republics of Greece and later Rome itself, suggesting that the stereotype of Carthage as a purely mercantile, apolitical society may be an oversimplification shaped by Roman propaganda. Religion sat at the heart of Carthaginian life, centered on gods inherited from their Phoenician ancestors. Chief among them were Baal Hammon, a god associated with fertility and the sun, and Tanit, a powerful goddess who came to be seen as a protector of the city itself. Temples dedicated to these deities anchored civic life, and Carthaginian religious practice would eventually become one of the most controversial and debated aspects of the entire civilization. This brings us to one of the most sensitive and hotly contested questions in all of ancient history. Did the Carthaginians practice child sacrifice? Roman and Greek writers accused Carthage of sacrificing infants to Baal Hammon and Tanit, particularly during times of crisis, claiming children were burned alive as offerings at a site the Romans would later call the Tophet. For centuries, many modern historians dismissed these claims as wartime propaganda, a way for Rome to paint its rival as monstrous and therefore deserving of destruction. Ancient writers, after all, had every incentive to demonize an enemy they had annihilated. However, archaeological excavations at the Tophet of Carthage have complicated this picture. Researchers have uncovered thousands of burial urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young children, alongside animal remains, buried beneath inscribed stone markers dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon. According to some archaeologists who have studied the skeletal remains, the age distribution and burial patterns are consistent with deliberate ritual sacrifice rather than a simple infant cemetery. Other researchers strongly disagree, arguing that the remains may instead reflect extremely high rates of infant mortality in the ancient world, with grieving families dedicating their naturally deceased children to the gods through religious burial rather than killing them outright. The evidence remains genuinely debated among archaeologists and historians today, and no definitive consensus has been reached. What can be said with confidence is that the Tophet was a real and significant religious site, that child burial there followed specific ritual patterns, and that the full truth behind those patterns may never be entirely settled. It stands as a powerful reminder that history is rarely as simple as ancient enemies described it, and that even modern science, with all its tools, cannot always deliver certainty about the deep past. What is certain is that Carthage's wealth and power eventually placed it on a collision course with a rising power just across the sea, Rome. For a long time, Rome and Carthage had coexisted, even cooperated. Early treaties between the two powers, some of the oldest surviving diplomatic documents in Western history, defined zones of trade and influence, with Rome largely focused on the Italian peninsula while Carthage dominated the seas. But as Rome expanded southward and Carthage tightened its grip on Sicily, that balance became impossible to maintain. In 264 BCE, the fragile peace shattered. A dispute over the city of Messina in Sicily dragged both powers into a conflict that would explode into the First Punic War, the beginning of more than a century of on-and-off warfare between Rome and Carthage, a struggle so vast and so consequential that historians still study it as one of the defining conflicts in the shaping of the ancient world. The First Punic War was fought largely at sea, a domain where Carthage was supposed to hold every advantage. Yet Rome, remarkably, built a navy from almost nothing, and according to Roman sources, even reverse-engineered a captured Carthaginian warship to design their own fleet. After more than 2 decades of brutal, grinding conflict, Rome emerged victorious, forcing Carthage to abandon Sicily and pay a crushing war indemnity. It was a humiliation Carthage would not forget. Out of that humiliation rose one of history's most legendary military minds, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was raised, according to ancient sources, with a deep and personal hatred of Rome, reportedly swearing an oath as a child, at his father's insistence, to never be a friend to the Roman people. Whether this specific story is literal fact or later embellishment remains debated, but what is not in doubt is what Hannibal accomplished as an adult. In 218 BCE, at the outbreak of the Second Punic War, Hannibal did something almost no one in Rome believed possible. He marched an army, including a contingent of war elephants, over the Alps and invaded Italy directly, striking not from the sea, where Rome now held the advantage, but from the mountains at Rome's back door. What followed was a campaign that stunned the ancient world. At battles like Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal inflicted catastrophic defeats on Roman armies, using terrain, deception, and brilliant tactical encirclement to destroy forces that vastly outnumbered his own. Cannae in particular is still studied in military academies today as one of the most complete tactical victories in the history of warfare. For over a decade, Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside, undefeated in open battle, coming closer to breaking Rome than any enemy commander before him. And yet Rome did not break. This is perhaps the most underrated part of the entire story. Rome's true strength was never simply its army. It was its refusal to surrender, its deep reserves of manpower, and its ability to absorb defeat after defeat while its rivals isolated victories, however brilliant, never quite translated into a final, decisive blow. While Hannibal terrorized Italy, Rome quietly shifted strategy, striking at Carthaginian holdings in Spain and eventually taking the war directly to North Africa itself. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, a young Roman general named Scipio, who had studied Hannibal's tactics and adapted them, finally defeated Hannibal on Carthaginian soil. The Second Punic War ended in another crushing Carthaginian surrender. Carthage lost its overseas territories, its navy, and much of its independence, reduced to a shadow of the empire it had once been. Most cities at this point might have faded quietly into irrelevance. Carthage, remarkably, did not. Freed from the burden of maintaining a vast military empire, Carthaginian trade and agriculture flourished once again in the decades that followed. Within a generation, the city had rebuilt so much of its wealth that Roman observers grew nervous all over again. This resurgence, according to many historians, is precisely what set the stage for the final and most brutal chapter of the story. Roman Senator Cato the Elder became infamous for ending every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same ominous phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." It was not a policy proposal. It was an obsession. And in 149 BCE, Rome finally acted on it, provoking a final conflict known as the Third Punic War, using a technical treaty violation as pretext for what many historians now describe as a war of deliberate, premeditated annihilation. The siege of Carthage that followed was one of the most horrific events of the ancient world. For nearly 3 years, the city held out against overwhelming Roman force, its citizens reportedly melting down bronze statues to forge weapons, and its women, according to ancient accounts, cutting off their own hair to be woven into bowstrings when supplies ran short. But by 146 BCE, Roman forces finally breached the walls, and what followed was days of brutal, house-to-house, fighting through streets never designed for war. Ancient sources describe scenes of horrifying devastation. The city burning for 17 days straight, tens of thousands killed, and the survivors, somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people according to some ancient estimates, sold into slavery. The claim that Roman soldiers salted the earth around Carthage to ensure nothing could ever grow there again is one of history's most enduring legends, though many modern historians now consider it a later embellishment rather than a documented historical event, since salt would have been prohibitively expensive to use in such enormous quantities. What is certain without dispute is that Carthage was systematically demolished, its walls torn down, its buildings razed, and its territory formally annexed as a Roman province. For over a century, the site sat largely abandoned, a haunted ruin on a hillside above the sea. It was Julius Caesar, and later Emperor Augustus, who eventually ordered a new Roman city built atop the old Carthaginian ruins, an almost symbolic act of dominance, building Roman Carthage directly on the bones of the civilization Rome had annihilated. This new Roman Carthage would go on to become one of the largest and wealthiest cities of the Roman Empire, a strange irony given the city's violent origins. Much of what we know about Punic Carthage today comes to us not from the Carthaginians themselves, but through the writings of the very civilization that destroyed them. Roman and Greek historians, writing decades or even centuries after the fact, shaped the narrative we inherited, often portraying Carthage as cruel, treacherous, and barbaric, a convenient justification for the scale of destruction Rome had unleashed. Modern archaeology has slowly worked to recover a more balanced picture, uncovering inscriptions, artifacts, shipwrecks, and the physical remains of the city itself, allowing historians to hear, in fragments, a version of the story told by Carthage rather than only about it. What emerges from that fragmented record is a civilization far more complex than the villain of Roman legend. Carthage, was a society built on trade rather than conquest for much of its history, a republic governed by elected officials rather than a single tyrant, a naval power whose engineering and seafaring skill rivaled anything the ancient Mediterranean had produced. It was also, almost certainly, a society with practices that would trouble modern sensibilities, one whose full religious and cultural reality we may never completely recover, buried as it is beneath layers of conquest, propaganda, and time. Today, the ruins of Carthage sit within the modern city of Tunis, a UNESCO World Heritage Site drawing archaeologists and travelers who come to walk among the remnants of harbors that once launched 1,000 ships, and temple foundations where a controversial and still debated religious history once played out. Excavations continue even now, slowly adding new pieces to a puzzle that will likely never be fully complete. Perhaps that incompleteness is the most fitting legacy of all. Carthage was a civilization defined, in its final chapter, by erasure, a deliberate attempt by the victors of history to determine not just who would rule the Mediterranean, but who would get to tell the story afterward. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, we are still here, still digging, still questioning, still trying to hear the voice of a city that was silenced before it could fully speak for itself. So here is the question worth sitting with. When the winners of history get to write the only surviving account of the losers, how much of what we call historical fact is really just the last word in an argument the other side never got to finish? What do you think really happened at Carthage? And how much of the truth do you believe still lies buried beneath that quiet hillside above the sea? Let us know in the comments.